In December of 2006, inside a quiet government office in London, a routine transaction was completed. There were no cameras, no speeches, no public attention. A clerk at the British Treasury processed a payment to the United States Treasury. It was the final installment on a debt that had existed for more than 60 years. With that transfer, a financial obligation dating back to the aftermath of World War II officially ended. For most people, it meant nothing. For history, it closed one of the longest and least discussed financial chapters of the 20th century, because that payment was not just about money. It was the final echo of a transformation that reshaped global power. This is the story of how that transformation began. At the outbreak of World War II, Britain was not a declining nation. It was still the center of the global financial system. The British Empire covered roughly a quarter of the world's land and population. London was the world's primary financial hub. The pound sterling functioned as a global reserve currency. British overseas investments spanned continents, generating steady income that balanced trade and sustained imperial influence. By every traditional metric, Britain entered the war as a financial superpower. But beneath that strength was a vulnerability that war would expose. Britain was an island nation that depended heavily on imports. Food, fuel, steel, oil, and industrial materials flowed in from across the world. Even in peacetime, Britain imported far more than it exported. War transformed that dependency into a strategic weakness. German submarines targeted merchant shipping. Ports were bombed. Supply lines became lifelines. To survive, Britain needed enormous quantities of goods, and there was only one country capable of providing them at scale: the United States. In 1939 and 1940, the United States was officially neutral. American law reflected public skepticism about foreign wars. Congress had passed neutrality legislation that restricted how belligerent nations could access American industry. The rules were simple. Foreign powers could buy American goods only on a cash-and-carry basis. No loans, no credit. Immediate payment using gold or dollars, and transportation handled by the buyer. For Britain, this created an urgent dilemma. The country needed weapons, fuel, food, and industrial supplies in enormous quantities, but it could only pay with finite reserves. At first, Britain used gold. Shipments crossed the Atlantic under naval protection, carrying bullion to North America. Then came securities. British citizens were required to surrender American stocks and bonds, which the government sold to raise dollars. Next came overseas investments. Railways, mines, factories, and income-producing assets were sold, often quickly and at unfavorable prices. Each sale solved an immediate problem and created a long-term one. By late 1940, Britain faced a stark reality. Its easily liquidated assets were nearly exhausted. The war, however, was far from over. At this moment, British leadership confronted an uncomfortable truth. Britain could not continue the war without external support, and it could not continue paying for that support indefinitely. This forced a political and financial reckoning. American leadership understood Britain's position. If Britain collapsed, the strategic balance in Europe would tilt decisively. But assistance faced political constraints. American voters opposed direct involvement. Congress resisted anything that resembled a bailout. The solution had to appear temporary, practical, and justified. That solution became known as Lend-Lease. Publicly, it was framed as a pragmatic arrangement. The United States would supply goods essential to the war effort, with the expectation that they would be returned or compensated later. Privately, negotiations were more complex. Before extending support, American officials wanted full transparency into Britain's financial position. They demanded detailed accounting of assets, reserves, and holdings. From the American perspective, this was fiscal responsibility. From the British perspective, it felt less like an alliance and more like a financial audit. Nevertheless, the alternative was existential. Britain accepted. As Lend-Lease moved forward, financial decisions accumulated consequences. Britain continued selling overseas assets. Income streams that had supported imperial stability disappeared. Markets once dominated by British firms became available to competitors. Meanwhile, American industry expanded rapidly. Factories produced not only military equipment, but also consumer goods for global markets. The wartime economy reshaped industrial capacity on both sides of the Atlantic. Another agreement soon followed, driven by military necessity. Britain desperately needed naval vessels to protect shipping routes. The United States possessed older destroyers that were no longer central to its naval strategy. A deal was reached. In exchange for these ships, the United States obtained long-term access to British military bases across the Atlantic and Caribbean. The arrangement strengthened American strategic reach and reshaped hemispheric defense. Individually, each agreement appeared reasonable. Collectively, they marked a shift. Britain was trading long-term leverage for short-term survival. As the war progressed, Britain endured. It fought. It sacrificed. It remained standing. But victory brought a new challenge. When the war ended in 1945, the emergency systems that had sustained Britain vanished almost overnight. Lend-Lease shipments stopped. Financial flows ended. Britain's economy, still structured around wartime production, faced a sudden reckoning. Factories built for weapons could not immediately produce consumer goods. Imports remained essential, but payment mechanisms were gone. The result was another crisis, this time without the justification of global war. Britain needed financial assistance once more. Negotiations resumed, this time in a changed world. The United States emerged from the war economically strengthened. Its industrial base was intact, its currency was dominant, its political confidence had grown. The assistance offered came in the form of a loan. It was large enough to prevent immediate collapse, but it came with conditions. One of those conditions involved currency policy. Britain was required to make its currency freely convertible into dollars within a defined period. Economists warned of the risks. Pent-up demand for dollars could overwhelm reserves. Capital flight could drain resources rapidly. But refusing the terms meant facing severe shortages. Britain accepted. The consequences unfolded quickly. When convertibility began, demand surged. Reserves fell. Within weeks, the system strained under pressure. The policy was suspended, but the damage was done. Confidence weakened. Britain's financial position deteriorated further. In the years that followed, Britain adjusted to its new reality. It reduced overseas commitments. It relinquished strategic responsibilities once considered permanent. It devalued its currency. At the same time, a new global financial system took shape. In international negotiations during the war, institutions were designed to govern post-war finance. They were built around currency stability, development lending, and crisis management. The structure reflected the balance of power at the time of their creation. The United States held a central role. The dollar became the anchor currency. Financial institutions were headquartered in Washington. These institutions would later play a major role in shaping global economic policy. For Britain, the post-war decades involved adjustment rather than collapse. The country rebuilt domestically. Living standards improved over time. Political stability endured. But its global role had changed permanently. Former colonies pursued independence. Global markets diversified. Financial leadership shifted. Meanwhile, the loan remained. Year after year, payments continued. Across decades of political change, economic growth, and recession, the obligation persisted until December 2006. When the final payment was made, it marked the end of a formal debt. But the deeper transformation had concluded long before. This story is not one of villains and victims. It is a story of systems, incentives, and timing. Britain made decisions under pressure. The United States acted according to its interests. The global order adjusted accordingly. War accelerates change. Finance determines who adapts best. By the end of the 20th century, global power rested less on territory and more on currency, institutions, and leverage. The mechanisms that reshaped Britain would later appear elsewhere, adapted to different contexts and crises. Understanding this history helps explain the modern world. Because power today is rarely seized by force, it is structured through agreements, conditions, and systems that outlast the moments that created them. And sometimes, the most consequential events leave behind no monuments at all, only paperwork.